Sorry, the question is the budget responding to the needs of people living in South Africa? I'll start with Duma.
I think first of all, Siba, thanks for this invite. It's an honor to be on this platform again. So I just want to say that I think first of all, people need to understand the scale of what we're faced with. Number one, we have the second highest unemployment rate in the world after Eswatini, where I went to school, high school. We've got 12.3 million people who are unemployed, an overall unemployment rate of 41.9%. 70.7% for youth, 46% for Africans, 50% for African women, 52.8% in the Northwest. And we've got 1.1 million unemployed graduates. I got so angry yesterday. I was on a panel with one of these mainstream economists, Dr. Azar Jammine, and at the Human Rights Commission. And he said the reason that people are unemployed, the graduates are unemployed, is because they do subjects that the labor market doesn't want. So that is just not true at all. Yeah. So I just want to say that. So now, if we talk about young South Africans, young people, we've got. I've just got it here in front of me. We've got 7.2 million unemployed young people, and the reality that we're faced with is that over the last 16 years, from the fourth quarter 2008 to the fourth quarter 2024, 700,000 young people lost their jobs. So, Dr. Jammine, there are no jobs for young people. I think people need to understand that, and instead of blaming the victim for the victims of this situation. And the unemployment rate for all people is about 55%. And I just have to say, in terms of the stats, I'm adamant I never use the official definition. The official definition in the South African context makes no sense whatsoever because, first of all, there are no jobs, so people are discouraged to go and look for work. And secondly, Youth Capital has done so much work in terms of the cost of, looking for work. I think last time I looked, it was close to 1,000 rand. People spending money they don't have to look for jobs that they don't have. And then the last thing I want to say is that the world unemployment rate is 4.9%. And the last time I looked at the ILO website, there were 80 countries that have achieved full employment, which I define as a unemployment rate that is less than 5%. Yeah. So in terms of the drivers of unemployment, before I quickly talk about the budget, is that obviously we need a GDP growth rate that is much higher than it is now. So in the work that I've done for Youth Capital, if you cut and slice the data over the last 30 years, it shows that there's what is called an employment multiplier of about 0.9. So if GDP increases by 1%, employment increases by 0.9%. So we saw that relationship during an area when we grew fast from 2003 to 2008 and the last 16 years as well. So for more than 20 years, we've seen that trend. So we need a higher growth rate. Now, obviously, next thing we need to do is to incentivize sectors that employ more people who are low level of skills, the kind of profile of the people that we have who are unemployed. And in the budget, there's, I think, page 28, they show you the different employment multipliers of the different sectors. And I think construction, agriculture, transport and communication have got the highest employment multipliers. So on average, those are, I think, about 0.9. I can't remember what the numbers were, but they've got high employment multipliers, so we should focus on those. And then the third thing, which I was really disappointed in all my work and advocacy around unemployment, I find that political parties, they just don't understand this, We have public employment programs. We've got 3 of them. We've got the Presidential Employment Stimulus, we've got the Community Works Program, we've got the Expanded Public Works Program. So we've got these. So we obviously need to expand these public employment programs beyond what they are now. So now, if we look at the budget, now what the budget did, the Minister of Finance never talked about the budget. He never talked about unemployment. He blue-ticked the unemployment crisis, as he always does, I have to remind you. And what you see, which shows you that all the things that they said they would do in the budget won't work, is the GDP growth target. So the GDP growth target is about 1.8%. Not target, the GDP growth that they forecast, not target, forecast. It's about 1.8%. That is way too little from what we need as a country. For example, according to my work, we need to have a GDP growth rate of 4% just to cater for the 760,000 people will enter the labor market every year until 2036. So that is the scale of the problem. And that is not reducing the unemployment rate. That is just catering for the new entrants into the labor force. So the growth rate of the economy is far lower than is needed. And everyone in Parliament, you saw yesterday, everybody has attacked this GDP growth target. It's too optimistic because our economy grew at 0.6% last year and 0.7% the previous year. So the finance minister never explained to us, how will you treble the growth rate in this year? So, so for me, every single budget, I read all of them. They don't care about the jobs crisis. The central bank doesn't care about the jobs crisis. And the final thing people have to say is that in terms of the budget, we have to understand that the primary objective of economic policy is to grow the economy and create jobs. And if you can't grow the economy and create jobs, then you're not doing your job. It's not to balance the budget. That is not the objective of the primary objective of economic policy. It's to grow the economy and create jobs. Yeah, so I'm trying to, so I think people need to understand that is that, over the last 16 years, we've grown by 1.1% a year, and our average living standards are lower than they were in 2007. That is not a normal situation, and South Africans should not be okay with that, So those are so the budget, as usual, said nothing about jobs. There's no strategy from this government as to how to create jobs. And it's so depressing. And this is it should be the number one priority in our country, I say. Thank you.
Okay, passing over to Pearl. Is the budget responding to the needs of people living in South Africa?
Look, I think it responds to the needs of rich people in South Africa really well, because they get to escape the impacts of having an economy that isn't growing, being jobless, not being able to access social services properly. So, if you are a Discovery client, if you, bank with Investec, I think you're looking at this budget going, oh, this is fine. Increasing VAT, this is fine. But I think if you are in the majority of South Africans, and especially if you are a young South African, I think you would look at this budget and go, what country is this, right? Is this the same country that has the highest youth unemployment rate in the world? I mean, Duma was saying in his input that the minister did not mention unemployment, right? He barely said the word youth in the budget. And if you think about it, right, we've all said that youth unemployment is by far the biggest crisis facing South Africa. We have 10 million young people who are sitting at home, not in education, employment, or training, right? That is an insane crisis. And we often say, oh, it's a ticking time bomb. It's not ticking anymore, right? It's fully exploded. When you have 10 million young people sitting at home without any education, training, or employment opportunities, and then you present a national budget that does not speak about youth unemployment at all, you really have to sit and wonder whose budget is this? And I think we've seen over the years, right, the education budget, the health budget, the social services budget have decreased. We saw the impacts of this in the ways in which people are not able to access things like healthcare, the fact that we can't employ teachers, we can't employ doctors. And so when you look at the budget as a citizen and you think about the services you are meant to access, and you have to think about how much further you have to stretch your money every month, that budget is not responsive to any of our needs, right? And in the meantime, so I mean, we've lamented the VAT increase. I think there's two things on that show you kind of, I think, the disrespect in which we're being spoken to as citizens. So when they said, well, we're increasing that, but we are also increasing the amount of zero-rated items. And I thought it was so interesting that the minister skipped over the line in the speech that clarified what the items were going to be. So, for example, he said meat and poultry products. He didn't say that it's actually, chicken livers and offal, right? And I think it's a very interesting way of saying to people that when we think about what poor people must consume, this is what we think you should be eating. Whereas the rest of us can shop at Woolies, right? And over and above that, you look at a VAT increase and they go, oh, there's nothing more we could have done. But we have one of the most bloated cabinets we've ever had. The public sector wage bill is not decreasing. Ministers' salaries are not decreasing. The amount of money we spend on ministerial perks alone is not decreasing. And so South Africans are meant to stretch their pockets, but the political elite gets to kind of carry on as normal. And so, I think to answer the question, if you do look at the budget, I think it sends a very clear message to South Africans about the level of priority our government places us on. It tells us a very clear message about what are the issues that they are prioritizing or not prioritizing. I thought this budget was very sort of internationalist focused, right? It kind of followed the tune of the State of the Nation address, which, our wonderful president is about to live his best life during G20, right? We know that he loves international events. We know he loves doing the PR of South Africa. And so they structured both SONA and the budget to kind of fit this profile of this country that's making waves globally. But locally, they've said, oh, well, South Africans are going to have to bear the cost of that PR exercise. And so I think it's a budget that's incredibly strange, but not surprising at all, because I think we've seen over the years steadily that our government does not actually prioritize South Africans, particularly young ones.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Okay, I have a question for Duma, right? Every time we listen to the National Treasury, it sounds like we don't have an alternative. In your view, what alternative economic strategies could the government have taken to stimulate growth while maintaining fiscal responsibility? Sorry, Duma, your mic is off.
We saw in Parliament yesterday, about 20 organizations gave their inputs, and all of them gave alternatives as to what should be done. We saw, I think the previous day, I'm not sure, political parties, all of them are giving their alternatives, and I think it's wrong for National Treasury to be saying that there is no alternative. But what we're seeing in the parliamentary debates is that National Treasury, the finance minister, is isolated, and so I don't understand why the ruling ANC is sticking to a policy that is so universally unpopular amongst ordinary South Africans, whether it's the political parties or the 20 civil society organizations that rejected the budget yesterday in Parliament, And so there are lots of alternatives. So what we need is a growth budget. So instead of talking about budget shortfalls, because it's quite frankly a meaningless word, because the so-called shortfall is an arbitrary number that the government decided that they want to tax from the people. It is completely arbitrary. It's got nothing to do with anything. So the increase of spending is 400 billion, but they're going to tax back about 120. So it could have been 150, it could have been 200. It's just an arbitrary number. It's not a shortfall. So what we should be talking about is GDP growth shortfalls. So I believe we need a minimum GDP target of 6% as a country that is non-negotiable, that is binding on the two most important institutions in the country, National Treasury and the Reserve Bank. Now, what does that mean in practice? In practice, it means we're an 8 trillion rand economy, and we are going to grow realistically this year maybe 1.5%. So you look at the GDP growth forecast and you say, what is the shortfall to achieve the GDP growth shortfall? So in my calculation, it's about 240 billion rands. And then you can also look at the NDP. They talked about infrastructure, 1 trillion. But when I looked at the 1 trillion infrastructure, the way we look at it as a percentage of GDP. So we saw that in the first year, it's 4.2% of GDP. The second year, it's 4%, and the third year, it's 3.9% of GDP. So it's not growing, it's growing slower than the slow growth of the economy. So it's not going to stimulate the economy. So the shortfall over the medium term expenditure framework period, which is a 3-year budgeting cycle, is 1.5 trillion. So those are the shortfalls that we should be looking at, not these artificial shortfalls. So if I was in charge, I would look at now in Parliament yesterday, I saw a little bit of clips on TV. People were making different proposals as how we can, finance this growth budget. A lot of people talked about waste in the public service as what you call it, as Pearl was talking about, especially in the top management at central government level, because we should remember that 85%, I saw, according to a study by WIT's Southern Center for Inequality Studies, the majority of people in the public sector are doctors, nurses, in health workers, highly skilled people. They're also educators, they're also police officers, correctional services officers, they're judges. These are the so-called frontline staff. That's 85%. So a lot of people have been focusing on that, and we should cut waste, but we should remember that our public service is too small for the population that we have, as well. It's way too small. And I just got a spreadsheet from the Department of Health recently, because I'm doing work on national health insurance in my spare time. And we've got 20,000 doctors, less than 20,000 doctors for 83 million people who use the public service. That is shocking, yeah. And we've got less than 200,000 nurses. So I went and benchmarked that against the OECD, which is an organization of rich countries and some emerging markets, large ones like South Africa. And we need another 150,000 doctors to reach their benchmarks, and we need another 300,000 nurses. We also have to equalize our education systems, the two basic education systems. I am so opposed to private education. My son went to a private school, but I am so opposed to private education. We have to, my son, when he was studying, he started school outside of the country, and when he came to South Africa, we decided to take him to a public school. He literally cried for a month, and then we took him to a private school. But anyway, the point is we have to equalize the learner educator ratio. So that is, according to my calculation, 300,000 people. So this is the scale of the problems that we have, and so we have to create the problem. We have to create solutions to the problems that we have. So if we start focusing on economic growth and growing the economy, but obviously it has to be a growth that benefits the people, that results in GDP in the pocket, and not the rich people that Pearl was talking about. So there's additional mechanisms that we can do to get that growth. I'm a big supporter of universal basic income. I've been part of the campaign for the last 4 years. I think it was a successful campaign so far. I'm also a big believer in the job guarantee. I believe that we should, the language, people are having problems with my language, I was at a workshop on public employment, but we need to have a quasi-public institution situated outside of government that is going to finance a portfolio of public employment programs. So you have the presidential employment stimulus, you have those three that I talked about, the community works program, and you have the expanded public works program. So the money should go from the budget to that institution that has got professional management and civil society oversight. And then we must have a target to improve the quality of work, because there's a spectrum in terms of the quality of work these public employment opportunities provide. Some of them, I talked to many of the leaders of these things, like the worst one in my view was the community works program, where many of the people are cleaners. They don't get any training. They work 2 days a week. And the last time I looked, they were getting 1,100 Rand a month, you know, and they've been at this job for many years. So that is not a quality job. And then secondly, the wages that they earn are too low. And we must lift the wages to a living wage, which is above the inadequate minimum wage. So these are some of the things that we should be doing. And the budget, so they should monitor, ensure that there's a minimum quality of service, of quality of work. And also, I think there has to be a focus to a full-time jobs, because many of these opportunities, whether it's the National Youth Service, whether it's the Social Employment Fund, they provide 2 days of work a day. Because even if the government does everything, Siba, that I say they must do, and they grow the economy fast, there will still be millions of unemployed people. So this should be seen as a permanent institution that will be giving South Africans useful work. And it mustn't be seen as temporary work. Useful work that we need to build our country. And it should be a permanent feature of our society. And so there are many other things. Like, as I said, we need to have, you know, it's the 10th anniversary of Fees Must Fall. I'm a big believer in free tertiary education. We need to, I saw the EFF bill, we need to write off the 17 billion Rand student debt. In the same way, we wrote off the Eskom debt, and in the same way, we are writing off the municipality debt to Eskom, you know, because there's no hope in ever the government ever getting this money. And yesterday at the conference I was at, one lady said I think a member of her niece had graduated, but she was owing, I think, 70,000 that she couldn't pay, and she's not getting a certificate, and she's still unemployed. We can't allow that to continue, guys. It shouldn't be illegal for universities not to withhold certificates. They must give you a certificate with your qualifications, which you have worked hard for. And the government and the National Treasury must sort out the payment of whatever the student debt, because we keep kicking this can down the road in terms of the missing middle, 17 billion Rand student debt. But I just say, let's pay for it. Let's make it free for everybody. So that is another 50 billion Rand, because NSFAS currently provides funding for about half of the students, half of the people in the TVETs and the universities. So there's about, I think it's just under half. I've got the number somewhere. So I just think it's an investment in our future. These are the kind of things that we should be doing to make sure that the GDP translates into an improvement in the livelihoods of ordinary South Africans. And there's also, quickly, last one, so it's universal public services, education, health. Electricity is a big cost. We have to, the majority of South African families can't afford these electricity bills that keep rising, the 12.7% increase. What's going to happen is that the government will have to subsidize the electricity and expand the free basic electricity. So these are some of the things that we can bridge the gap between economic growth and development, and make sure that it is not, and we want a clean environment. You know, nowadays when I drive in Johannesburg, you know, I can actually smell the pollution from these. It's actually so it's just, I was talking to my son this morning, like I'm driving through Joburg. It's like, it smells like, it's like, so it's not normal. We should create a more, you know, a cleaner, you know, a climate, a cleaner society. And so those are some of the things that I would do. Sorry, I'm rambling. I'm not feeling well, but anyway, yeah.
And for Pearl, right, as we discussed, we don't feel like the budget is something that tackles the problems that young people face or people in South Africa face. We feel like its priorities are, you know, towards other things. If we continue down this path of cutting spending, what will the long-term consequences be for economic development and social mobility?
Cool. So, I mean, I think we've kind of seen last year during elections a very direct consequence of what happens when you cut spending on important things, right? So if you've seen me talk about elections at any point in the last couple of years, you would have seen me bemoan the budget cuts, for example, to the IEC. And what that meant is that in a really important national election last year, with a new electoral system, we faced a huge crisis where we had the IEC unable to perform its tasks as well as it usually does, right? And you can extrapolate that to the rest of society. So let's think about an average young person. You are born into poverty, you go to a public primary school and a high school that is under-resourced, that does not have sufficient teachers, does not have sufficient learning material. You somehow finish your matric and you get into university, but then you either can't go because you can't afford it, or you can go because you managed to get NSFAS. But then if you did get NSFAS, there's also chances that maybe your accommodation isn't being paid for, or your money isn't being dispersed early enough. I think NSFAS is a very interesting example because you see, I'm a NSFAS kid, and so I have many traumatic experiences of spending hours at the financial office at my university, queuing to sign those NSFAS papers, right? And having people get to the front and go, oh, money hasn't been allocated yet. And then when you look at the recoveries from universities at the end of every year for all of the unspent NSFAS money, you kind of wonder, well, when we stood in those queues and they told us that there was no money, what were they talking about, right? So let's say you're lucky enough that you got NSFAS and you've paid for university. You finish, and then, like Duma said, now you owe NSFAS, right? And the catch is they say, oh, well, you'll only start paying once you get a job. When are you likely to get a job? So there's this great organization, I don't know if you've heard about them, called Youth Capital. And the research that you guys actually did about the cost of looking for a job, right? Not finding a job, looking for a job. And when that research was done, it was an average of about 500 Rand a month that a young person needed, which is already almost double what the SRD is, right? So for all the people that look at the SRD and go, oh, people are just getting this money so they can sit at home and do nothing, I think you're crazy if you think that 350 Rand is the reason that people are 370. Sorry, we got that 20 Rand. That people are sitting at home and unable to find work. So you now are meant to find a job. You can't find a job because if you didn't get NSFAS and somehow you still managed to finish university, you have outstanding fees. So you can't actually get your qualification. And so you can't apply for jobs. And then you manage to get onto a government platform like sayouth.mobi. You've maybe been matched with a work opportunity, because we don't call them jobs. So you get matched with a work opportunity to go and resurface a main road somewhere, or you get to work at a call center, because when we think about youth employment, we think let's just put everybody to work at call centers for telecoms companies, right? And that's our plan. Everyone's going to work at a call center. And so if you're lucky enough to get that job, right, you're also earning peanuts because our wage inequality is incredible in our country. But now you're stuck having to either pay off your NSFAS debt or somehow find money to pay your university debt so that you can actually get your qualification. By the time you get that, you are mid-20s, right? You've got the social pressure at home because now you need to be the breadwinner. You went to university, you got educated. So you need to be helping your family. For a lot of young people, you're relied upon as the people that are going to help take your family out of poverty. That's what education is meant to do. And so you're not able to do that, right? I think we have an average that the average young person bounces between at least 7 internships before securing proper employment, right? Because again, when government thinks about job opportunities for young people, we are unable to think about work outside of internships that pay very low, that aren't interested in actually skilling young people for the workplace, but they kind of just create a revolving door of cheap employment for private companies, right? So you're bouncing around from internship to internship, and now you're well into what's supposed to be your adulthood, but you're unable to provide for yourself, you're unable to provide for your family, you're unable to create a savings account, right? You're unable to access quality healthcare. You are kind of bogged down by an incredibly difficult transport system. And so when you ask the question about social mobility, there is none, right? You kind of stagnate into this perpetual state of youth where your development kind of becomes arrested and you're not able to create a sustainable livelihood. You're not able to provide for your family. And then you have to vote every 5 years for the same people that are going to keep you kind of trapped in that cycle. And so I think the long-term consequences of that means that you're going to have all of the young people that are unemployed today are going to be the 40-year-olds that are unemployed in 5 years' time, right? All of the 10 million young people who are NEETs today are going to be adults who are NEETs in a couple of years' time. And so what does that mean for an economy that's struggling to grow, where you have the bulk of your workforce sitting at home, and increasingly you're seeing how the inequality gap continues to increase, right? And so you're sowing a lot of social discord. I mean, we've already kind of seen it now with our friends across the pond, I think highlighting, because I don't think that our social dysfunction has only been created by the United States, right? I think it just amplifies things that we already knew. But increasingly, you're going to have citizens that are not just upset with the government, but then start being upset with each other. And we've seen how those attitudes kind of take hold when it comes to, for example, our relationship with migrants and immigrants, right? And that it's only kind of a matter of time before those attitudes start creeping up on each other. And so I think socially, what that means is that you create a deeply, deeply fractured society, far more than we already have. People disengage from public life. So I think the election polls, for example, in the next 2 or 3 elections are really going to be scenes from a movie. And we kind of get trapped in this cycle where we want new, better leaders, but they don't emerge, or when they do emerge, it's only a matter of time before they become just like everybody else. You are increasingly sitting with cities that are dilapidating, right? Duma speaks about Johannesburg, and I cry every day on social media if you see me threatening our mayor with violence. If I see him in the street, we are going to have to square up, because you look at the state of what's supposed to be the economic hub of the country, and if you had 10 rand for every street light that doesn't work, we could solve the wealth crisis in South Africa just by Joburg alone, right? We had our president who, in an interview, what was it, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, said he was so shocked at the state of Johannesburg, as if he doesn't live there. And so it's a knock-on effect, right? Your cities fall into disrepair, your universities fall into crisis, because they are incredibly expensive machines that require education to not be free. But more and more people are not going to be able to afford it, right? A labor market that is not absorbing young people, that puts them into work opportunities that aren't sustainable. And what you eventually end up with is a country that's just even more further broken. And so I think, yeah, for social mobility and for economic development, we're heading very, very quickly it's a race to the bottom at this point, because you're creating a generation of young people that are increasingly angry, that are increasingly locked out of the economy, and then by so doing gets locked out of public life. And I don't know what that means, or I think we do know what that means for the kind of citizenry we're shaping for the next few years.
Okay, thank you so much, Pearl. For Duma, right? I think one of the things that you hit on when you were presenting the alternative measures were like different forms of social protection. And part of what Pearl also mentioned was, the SRD, for example, which is another form of social protection that we have in South Africa. So the question is, many South Africans often rely on, social grants, yet there are concerns that the budget may not be doing enough to strengthen social protection. Are these concerns, per your opinion, justified?
Thank you, Siba. There was such a brilliant explanation of the challenges of being young by Pearl. I'll be listening to the podcast again, in my time. Yes, so I'm part of the campaign, as I said, for universal basic income. So I worked for an organization called Social Policy Initiative, and we did a lot of work over the past 4 years, different studies about social protection, and many African countries and many other countries in South Africa and so forth. And the last one, which I'm working on at the moment, is there was a study from Brazil by Brazilian economists who looked into social protection in 42 countries. And they found that social protection has got very high multipliers in the economy. So, for example, in Mexico, I think it was 4.7. So every billion rands that you spend in the economy, it multiplies by 4.7 billion. So we commissioned the lead researcher there, a guy called Dante Cardoso, to develop a social protection multiplier for South Africa, and we're going to publish a paper soon. He came to a figure of 1.74 in terms of the social protection multiplier after 10 quarters. So South Africans need to understand that social protection is one of the basket of the basket of things that we have to, I saw in the comments, like, how do we bridge the gap between GDP growth and development? And social protection is one of them, because, and I have to repeat, no matter if the government does everything that I say they must do, there'll still be lots of poor people for a very long time. So we have to give them social protection. We have to give them public employment programs. We can't just say you must wait for economic growth. Yeah. So our version of the of the universal basic income, it was given to adults 18 to 59. And then I thought the stimulus to the economy wasn't adequate. So I said, let's give it. I asked my colleague Isabel, I think it must go to children as well. So children currently get child support grant. I think it's 530 or 60 or something. So the current, it should be pegged at the 3 poverty lines. I think the lowest one is about 780 rands. And so the highest one is, I think it's about 1,600. So we modeled this according to the 3 poverty lines, and we escalated them for 3 years. And we came to, in year 3, if you're a mother with 3 children, you'll get 1 for yourself, and then you'll get 1 for your 3 children. And it was at 1,800 rand a month, and it would be 7,200 rands that you get, Now, people say there's a lot of myths around social protection, that we spend a lot compared to other countries, and it's not true. Yeah. So, the latest statistics that I saw from the ILO, I think it was the ILO, we spend about 5.5% of GDP on social protection, and that is below the upper middle income average. That includes contributory social protection, like your unemployment insurance fund, and things like that. So it's 5.5% of GDP. I was shocked, the average rich country spends 17%. I saw Japan spends, it's one of the highest. I think they spend 17, 18%, the most capitalist society in the world, And many of the upper middle income countries, they spend more than us. And the North African countries, they spend more than us. And so I think we should get away from this myth that we spend a lot. But even if we were spending a lot, our challenges in terms of poverty, and I think someone was mentioning the statistic, I think it was Pearl, around hunger, or was it you, Siba? Hunger in our society. Like, it is crazy. Like, so we have to, I think about a quarter of our population goes hungry, so we have to address issues of hunger. So I see the universal basic income as a first dignity floor, below which nobody should fall. And then the job guarantee is a second dignity floor. Because once you have universal basic income, you will probably want income through work, So the job guarantee would provide a second floor. It would eliminate exploitative work in the private sector. You see these women and who are working in retail. They work on, inadequate. I talk to them all the time, in short shifts, you don't know from week to week whether Discam is going to call you to come and work, or Woolies is going to call you, and you're waiting on the phone, and the labor broker will call you, say, no, we've got a gap at at Woolies or Dis-Chem or whatever, it's not a way to live, So I just think that it will set up another floor above the minimum wage, because most South Africans agree that this minimum wage is inadequate. People fought for this minimum wage, and we must celebrate that. But most people think so. I think it should be slightly above the minimum wage to address this issue. So that's how we saw at the Social Policy Initiative these things social, and we got rid of this false dichotomy or binary between social protection and jobs. And we said we must do them both, because my favorite quote comes from Martin Luther King all those years ago. He talked about the need for guaranteed income, which is what we call now universal basic income. And he talked about a need for a bill of rights, an economic bill of rights that would have guaranteed income and a job guarantee as well. So this is part of a global campaigns that are being run throughout the world around those two issues, and I'm part of those campaigns. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Duma. For Pearl, we've heard a lot of things mentioned by both you and Duma around like social protection and grants, etc. And it's often said that government puts grants and public employment programs on each other, pits them on each other. Is that so? Do you feel like that's so?
I think that's such an interesting question, because I obviously can't speak to the technical parts of how we budget for social protection versus jobs, right? And I think we can kind of see the investments that we make in jobs versus the money that we allocate in social protection. But it's also not like social protection is increasing exponentially, right? It's not. I think a lot of this conversation is more about social conditioning than it is actually about what is possible in the fiscus. If you walk around South Africa and you start talking about social protection, and we've seen it through our work on the universal basic income, right? Where you talk to people about the idea of a universal basic income. And it's always so interesting the way people speak about social protection as if it is nothing. It's as if being entitled to certain, government services is wrong. So they say, young girls are going out and getting pregnant so that they can get the child support grants. I can promise you, nobody is doing that. People are just using the SRD so that they can sit at home and not work. I can promise you, nobody's doing that. But a lot of this is about our collective attitudes, right? And the way we think about social welfare, the way we think about whether or not poor people should eat, right? And we sit and go, oh, well, because government is spending so much money on social protection, they can't now spend money on creating an environment for jobs or growing the economy or getting more investments, right? And I just don't think that those two things have anything real to do with each other. But it really helps when you have a country of people, a lot of them, the bulk of whom are actually on some form of social protection or the other. And those very same people will sit and go, oh, well, people need to stop getting handouts and people need to stop abusing the grant system, right? Because what it does is inevitably, as our social grants, even when there is a decrease, right, on the biggest scale, even if there's an increase, on a larger scale, they're not, because you're not getting grants that are increasing with inflation. You're not getting grants that are increasing according to unemployment, for example. So it's not like the amount of money that people get from our social protection system is enough, right? I mean, Duma was talking about how the child grant works, right? And just on that, you think about the difficulties that people face. If you have, I think, the foster care grant, then you can't get like a child support grant, right? There's all of these contradictions within the system that actually make it very difficult for people to access this money. And I think it works very conveniently, right? When you then create these attitudes amongst people in the country that says that we have to choose between social protection and a growing economy, or we have to choose between social protection and public employment. And I just don't think it's a choice that we have to make. So, people say, oh, that governments give people grants because it's a way to secure votes, right? And people would much rather just take grants instead of looking for jobs. And this is just a way that taxpayers are meant to go and, bankroll everybody else in the country. Everybody pays tax, first of all, right? There isn't a single person in this country that does not pay tax. We all pay tax. Some of us may pay more, but you pay more because you earn more. And that's on capitalism, right? But we can't create or we can't create this mentality, first of all, that the most vulnerable in our society must just fend for themselves, right? This pull ourselves by our bootstraps mentality is a very kind of American mindset, and we're seeing how it's serving the people in that country too. And so we often have to kind of choose, I think, between public employment programs and SRD grants. But I don't think that choice is a choice that is reflective of economics or fiscal policy in any way. I think it's a choice about values, and it is a thing that allows us, it's the same conversation we have about immigrants. It's easy to look at immigrants and go, oh, they're the reason why we have all the problems we have in our country, right? But we don't talk about the fact that buildings, for example, in our CBDs get to be hijacked because the municipalities in our CBDs aren't interested in actually creating cities that work. And so I think we create these issues as scapegoat issues. And I think a lot of how we look at social protection is a scapegoat issue. And what we're doing is we're trying to erode a sense of values. Even when we talk about free education, I mean, I'm a little bit shocked. I can't believe, that it was really 10 years since Fees Must Fall. It does not feel like 10 years have passed. But even during Fees Must Fall, right, when we were out there getting shot at by policemen, people were saying, oh, well, if you can't afford education, then you just mustn't go to school. Where does that mentality come from, right? How did we become a society that says that things like education, just the right to eat, is something that you need to work for? And so I think what we're doing is we're taking a discussion that's actually a values conversation, and we're pretending like it's an economic conversation, and I just don't think that that's a real thing.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Pearl. I'm just going to go through the Q&A quickly. And I think because you just answered one of the questions that we've had in the Q&A, which is from anonymous attendee, which says, government is happy to have the poor on grant while having enough taxpayers to keep them in balance. And then the next question we have in the chat here from Luhleli, which says, what is the estimate percentage of civil service pay to GDP in South Africa? And then they also had a follow-up question that says, what is the standard pay percentage compared to other countries with similar GDPs to ours as a country, which I think is something that Duma touched on. And then the last question is from Sean Mabundla, which says, in many cases, the benefits of a growing economy are disproportionately concentrated amongst political elites and large corporations, while the poor and working class citizens see little to no improvement in their living conditions. What this means is that a bigger pie, economic growth, does not necessarily mean that this will be equally shared. And then the question is, what kind of policies and mechanisms can be put in place to ensure that economic growth translates to tangible benefits for all South Africans, particularly in the most vulnerable societies? And I see that we're running out of time, and I do have still a couple of questions that I want to ask you, so I'll keep responses. Please keep the responses to a minute. Duma, would you like to respond to the last question? What kind of policies and mechanisms?
Okay, so I'll just tweak to what the civil service wage bill. So what you have is, you see, anything that is measured as a percentage of GDP, it's kind of meaningless, because when the economy is growing, like we had between 2003 and 2008, we employed more than 200,000 new public sector employees, but the wage bill as a percentage of government. Now, government spending tracks GDP. So the wage spending came down as a percentage of GDP. So I have a problem with these measures. And then what happened from 2009 to about 2012, people must remember that the average person in the, I wish I could give you like the spreadsheet on the screen, in the public service is more skilled than the normal South African, even in the private sector. When I was doing this work for COSATU, I was shocked that the 20,000 doctors that I talk about, you know, they earn about 1.2 million each. What should a doctor earn? And there was 6% of the entire public service wage bill, just for the doctors alone, you know, the inadequate doctors, you know. So what I want to say is that, so what happened is that they had this occupation-specific dispensation to improve the wages of the skilled people in the private sector. Nurses were emigrating and doctors were emigrating, so they tried to make the salaries a bit more competitive. So there was a once-off increase in these so-called occupation-specific dispensation, which is about 2/3, I think, of the public service, and they improved the salaries for everybody. But since then, 2012 to now, in an economy that is not growing, the wage bill as a percentage of total spending has come down sharply. And over the last 4 years, there have been no increases until last year, no increase whatsoever for anyone who works in the public service. So people, I just think that people, when we make international comparisons, so I believe that the last statistic I want to say on this is that I looked at the stats for 1995 to now. If the public service had kept up with the growth in the population as it should, we would have 600,000 more public servants than we have now. So we have to have a growing public service. We must eliminate waste in that public service and make sure that it's geared towards delivering good services, public services to the people, and not being wasted on corruption and all these other things, you know. So we need a proper public service. It will cost a lot of money to create this public service, and I believe a growing economy will make it possible. So a growing economy makes us possible to dream of the country when we were fighting for this freedom that we wanted to create. And then the second thing, in terms of the gap between growth and development, as I said, number one is UBI, which attacks the inequality head on. The job guarantee, number one. Number two. Number three, I did talk about universal public services. I strongly believe in free education and from basic to tertiary. I also believe in free healthcare. I'm a big supporter of, I think national health insurance, the word is misleading. I would rather call it a national health service like we have in the UK. And I believe that government will have to subsidize. I believe in public electricity and subsidized electricity. This bridges the gap between growth and development. And then there's so many things that we have proposed as to bridge that gap between growth and development. And also we have to address the issue of our transport system, our housing system, and so forth. And I agree with Pearl, there's not much time to talk about my favorite subject, which is migration, because it's a favorite scapegoat of people. At the age of 11, my parents sent me to school in Eswatini. There were people from 54 countries. And from that day on, I had a Pan-African identity. So I don't see issues of migration in the way many South Africans see them. And just quickly on the issue of migration is that people mustn't be ahistoric. Under apartheid, the model was to recruit people from the region. They came to work on our mines, and I won't really go into it, but people forget that the Mozambicans have been here since the middle of the 19th century. Ruth first wrote about it in her excellent work on her website that the family has set up. They came there to work in the sugarcane fields in KZN, and then they later went to the diamond fields, and then they later went to the gold fields in Johannesburg, in Gauteng. So by the beginning of the 20th century, 2/3 of the workers on the gold fields were from Mozambique and Lesotho as well. So people mustn't be ahistoric. Our borders have always been fluid as per apartheid policy. And what do you South Africans think Hugh Masekela was singing about in the song Stimela? He was talking about this train that brings people from the hinterland and so forth, the beautiful song. But anyway, so yeah, so that's my little 2 cents worth, you know. Yeah, I need to, yeah, I'm getting a bit tired now because I'm a bit fluey as well. Yeah.
Okay. From Pearl, we've also received a different question for you. As somebody who's in the National Planning Commission, how are we doing with some of our NDP 2030 goals? And do you think that the budget was tabled to enable us to achieve these goals?
You guys looked at my LinkedIn. So we released at the Planning Commission last year a review of the National Development Plan. We have 5 years left on its current term, and we kind of color coded, you know, green, yellow, and red against all of the targets that we have set, and we are not on track on a single one. We have no greens. We have a couple of yellows, but they're mostly red. And so according to our National Development Plan and the goals we've set there, we are not on track by any measure and every measure. I think the other thing to note, so about the National Planning Commission, since we're here, is that last year, the National Planning Commission's research budget was R0.00.
What?
Yes. It was fantastic at work last year. So the commission who's responsible for creating and advising on our development trajectory for the long term had R0.00 to do research last year. And I think that kind of gives you a sense of where we are at. We do have a little bit of a budget this year for research, but again, it's minuscule. And we've now, as planning commissioners, one of our roles is to go and fundraise. So we have to actually go and find money to get our work done. And we're supposed to be creating, you know, laying the groundwork for the new NDP, but we have no resources in which to do it. We're capacity strained in terms of people as well. And I think that kind of gives you some insight into how seriously we're taking development planning. But I think if you look at the NDP just as a plan itself, right, it's not a legally binding document in any way. It's a suggestion. And in an ideal world, you would have government departments kind of aligning with the NDP, but because the NDP is written so broadly, so vaguely, you can do nothing real and say, well, we align with the NDP because it prioritizes education in this way. And so, yeah, we're not on track to meet any of our targets by 2030. We are supposed to be creating new targets for 2050. We don't have the resources to do that in a real way. But I think the Planning Commission is full of people who are incredibly committed and are trying our best to try and produce something with very, very restrained resources. And so, you know, hopefully we can pull something together. The last thing I wanted to say, sorry, I know we're out of time almost, is on the public sector wage bill. I think one of the other things is you know, we spend just over 700 billion rand on the public wage bill, but we have a very top-heavy public sector. And I think a lot of it, so you look at it and you have this giant public sector, but it's an incredibly capacity strained, like Duma saying, we actually don't have a big public sector in many ways because we've created a very top-heavy one. And so you've got senior managers and directors that earn exceptionally well because they are skilled, but the work of government is actually something that happens a lot at the bottom. And I think one of the things that we need to be able to shift is the way we capacitate the public service, but it needs to be a bit more bottom heavy so that we can kind of justify that kind of spend. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much. And just for closing, as a closing question, you have 30 seconds to answer this question. For Duma, how can young people and advocacy groups hold the government accountable for economic policies that impact their future? 30 seconds.
Oh, can I pass to Pearl? I'm not young anymore.
Okay, Pearl.
Well, that's a good way of doing it, Duma. I think we need to get involved and we need to organize, right? We looked at the VAT increase and we all kind of sat on social media and we went, oh my God, this is so terrible. What are we going to do? But we don't organize exceptionally well as a collective. It's not just young people, right? So young people at universities, for example, organize incredibly well and have done so consistently. But a lot of our struggles don't often, we don't cut across class lines in the way that we organize. And I think that has to be a really central thing about what our citizenry needs to do going forward. And so you have the working class, for example, that is always organizing for service delivery in communities. We're the protest capital of the world, right? And so we already have people who are incredibly engaged. And what we need to do as young people is take our frustrations from social media and our university spaces and our community spaces into a more collective way of organizing. But like we always say, also support organizations that are also doing this work. We've got organizations like Youth Capital, like Youth Lab. Duma is part of the Universal Basic Income Coalition that is doing exceptional work on providing on lobbying and advocating for universal basic income. So I think looking at the kinds of social protections we need and really getting involved in formal and informal processes that help us get there.
All right. Thank you so much to Duma and Pearl, and thank you so much to each and everybody who participated in this webinar, who attended this webinar. We really appreciate it. As the capital, as you know, some of you may know or not know our work. We are an advocacy campaign that aims to solve youth unemployment in this country, and we do that through community engagement and going into government and parliament and going to decision makers and putting up there what are young people saying, what are communities saying about the things that there are decisions that the decision makers are making and are being impacted by. Really appreciate everybody that's here again. And yeah, thank you so much, guys, for taking time out of your day to attend this webinar and provide some of the best insights out there for people that may not know or understand the budget and what to look out for in future. Thank you so much.